Welcome everyone to a Dirt 4 setup video. In this video, we're not going to be actually driving any stages or events. We're going to be taking a look at how to set up the car. Now, this is going to be a very high level discussion. This isn't going to be for all you engineers out there, somebody who's been running racing sims for a very long time. This is probably going to be well beneath your current level of understanding. This is simply going to be about some quick things if you are either a beginner or maybe you're just a beginner at racing simulations and tinkering in the garage. This is going to be hopefully a very helpful tool to you to get started on some quick things that you can try in the garage, tuning the vehicle, and help your stage times. So, having said that, I will also mention from the very top that I'm not going to give you specific setups. If you're familiar with the channel, you know that I did setups for each individual track in the NASCAR Heat Evolution game. That's not going to happen here because this really isn't so much track specific or stage specific. These are ideas. These are principles that you can keep in mind because my goal here is to teach you something that you may not already know about how to set up the car to help you have more fun in the games, because that's what it is. It's a game, whether it's a simulation or an arcade game. It's all about having fun and getting better, achieving better lap times or stage times, as the case may be. There is no substitute for practice. So what I actually recommend you do before you try any of these is to pick a stage. In the case of the rally cars, go ahead, pick a stage and run it several times until you have consistent stage times. Keep a record of those stage times with the default setup before you make any changes. Keep a record of that. Keep a record of how the car feels to you. How does it feel on entry to a corner? Maybe it feels better on high-speed corners than low-speed corners. Maybe it's good on entry, but you can't seem to get off the corner very well at all. Maybe it's a little too tight. Maybe it's a little too loose. Now, I come from a NASCAR background, so you're going to hear me saying things like tight or loose. Tight is generally a synonym for that would be understeer. So tight, think understeer. Loose, think oversteer, depending on what your particular racing background is. But coming from the oval background, the asphalt background in NASCAR, I'm generally used to saying tight and loose. So you're probably going to hear those said multiple times. So always practice, run a section multiple times until you are consistent with your lap times. Then, and only then, should you go in and start making any changes. And then I would recommend making one change at a time. Never make multiple changes, 3, 4, 5 changes. You don't want to make wholesale changes and then go out and run another stage, because if the car is handling great, you don't know if it's a combination of all those things or maybe just one of those things made any difference. Only change one thing at a time. And again, run multiple stages until you get consistent lap times and see if you're faster or slower, and also how the car felt. Maybe it fixed one thing but hurt another thing. So all sorts of things to keep in mind. It's never going to be as simple as make one change and you're king of the world. So keep that in mind. So without further ado, let's go ahead and talk about some of the options. Now, first and foremost, always know your vehicle. Okay, in this particular case, we're looking at an R2 car, so the base level rally car. It's very underpowered, and it's front wheel drive. Two things to keep in mind. The underpowered tells you that you're probably going to spend a lot of the stage on the throttle and a lot of it at max throttle. So that means that you're going to need to keep in mind how the car behaves when you're on the gas pedal. Okay, front wheel drive means that the car is more likely to push, or again, understeer under throttle, because the front wheels are doing all the work on this car. The front wheels are not only accelerating the car whenever you get on the gas, they are also responsible for most of the braking, because under braking, most of the weight shifts to the front of the car unless you do some things, to get the back end to swing out. But they're responsible for accelerating, decelerating, and also cornering. So when you go through the corner, they're also sharing a huge portion of the load there as well. So keep that in mind. Front wheel drive car, there are some characteristics that you should immediately think that you're going to get from this car, even before you get in it and drive it. So let's take a look at the options you have. Again, this is going to be a very high level discussion. This isn't going to be detailed analysis of each and every one of these areas. That's not what this is about. This is about having fun with the game, some basic changes that you can do and how they might affect your car. And I'm going to start out by telling you the damping section about shocks we're not going to mess with, because in my experience, one of the, if not the quickest way to mess up a car is to mess with the shocks. If you don't know what you're doing, or if you start changing too much stuff in here, you can make a car behave very badly very quickly. This is more advanced, and now, don't get me wrong, I'm not telling you not to touch these. These can be tremendous, particularly off-road. But remember, this is a more beginner level type discussion, so we're not going to get into shocks. But by all means, jump in here, make some changes, and see how they affect your car. But if you're more of a beginner, even more of an intermediate type driver, I would recommend saving these toward the last, if not the last thing you start messing around with. Okay, with that being said, let's head into the alignment tab and take a look at the toe angle as well as the camber angle. So you can see immediately we have toe for the front and rear of the car. We have camber for the front and rear of the car. Now, we'll start with the toe angle. The toe, as you can see on the right over here where it's going to give you an illustration, toe defines the directionality of the wheels, the way they're pointing when you're essentially going straight ahead. Now, in this example, you can see these wheels are actually toed out. And we have a slight setting here of toed out. We're just past the midline here, so we're slightly toed out. And you can see in the bottom right below our illustration, you can see a toe out angle on the front wheels increases stability. Now, that's a fancy way of saying that the car doesn't want to turn. That's essentially telling you that the car is going to be tighter whenever you try to enter a corner, because the wheels are facing outwardly and they're essentially going to fight with each other a little bit. But a toe in angle can increase your turn in response, essentially meaning that the car will turn in better. You'll get better response from the front tires whenever you steer the wheel into the corner. So again, that's a very simple adjustment you can make. In general, in my experience on the ovals and on asphalt, this isn't a very huge adjustment either way. I'm not sure how it's done on the dirt, but keep in mind there that if you want to go toe in, then that can help your turn in on the front end of the car. So let's take a look at the rear end of the car. And one of the things that you will notice is that it's the opposite. Okay, here, whereas on the front we had toe in would help the car turn better, in the rear of the car, the toe in can actually help to contain the slide. If you're in a car that, particularly a rear wheel drive car, which wants to get a little bit tail happy on the dirt, then one of the things you can do is maybe put a little toe in the rear of the car, and that might help you to make those slides a little bit more manageable when they happen. Okay, and then of course the opposite is also true. A little bit of toe out can also help the car to turn. So these are two very quick adjustments you can make. I wouldn't recommend, maxing these out in either direction, but it's something you can play around with. Give a couple of clicks to test out. And in fact, it's not even a terrible idea if you decide that you want some, let's say that the default here is dead in the center in the rear toe angle, and you say, look, I want this car to really turn better. Okay, fine. Maybe you go in the direction, all the way in one direction or another if you want it to turn better, or if you want it to be more controlled in the rear end for a slide. Maybe try all the way to one extreme or the other. Now let's move on to camber. Okay, now camber is the lean of the car, the lean of the top of the tire, either in toward the car or away from the car. If it's leaning in, then that would be negative camber. If it's leaning, the top of the tire is leaning away from the car, then that would be positive camber. Now, we do not want positive camber here because we're turning both directions. In NASCAR, on an oval, you're only turning one direction, so you'll have positive camber on the left front, negative on the right front. But that's not what we're doing here, so we want negative camber on both. And you can see we start out, center line is -1.5. Okay, that's what they get you to start off with. And I can tell you that the more negative camber you put in this tire, the better it's going to corner, the faster you're going to be able to get through the corners. Because it's going to give you more grip. And what happens essentially in this, without getting too deep into it, is as you go through a corner, the weight of the car transfers toward the outside of the car. So if you're turning left, all the weight in the car wants to go toward the passenger side or the right-hand side of the car. And what that does is it makes the tire want to roll over and only use a portion of the tire in order to contact the road. Well, by putting more negative camber in it, we can put more negative camber in a tire and actually get a better contact patch, more of the tire contacting the ground, and actually help to turn the car. Now, there's some more things going on, but that's essentially what you're trying to do. So the more negative camber you can get, the better off you will be. The side effect can be that it becomes a little bit more unstable on the straight line. Okay, so if you're going down the straights, and I know I've experienced this in this game, where you're going down the straight and the car really doesn't want to go straight. It wanders all over the road. So keep in mind, more negative camber can make that worse, particularly at the rear of the car. Okay, now we're talking a front wheel drive car, so it's not as bad because the front wheels are driving the car. But if you're dealing with either a four-wheel drive car with a lot of torque toward the rear, or if you're talking about a rear-wheel drive car, then putting a lot of negative camber in the rear end can make it a little skittish on the straights, but boy, does it help in the corners. And you can see here, we start at -1.5, and it only goes up to a -3, but a great tool to try out. In fact, this is one of the first things, if I were you, I would try, because the game seems to really respond to the additional negative camber. Okay, with that in mind, let's move on to the brakes area. Now, there are two things here. First of all, to me, in the cars I've driven so far, and admittedly, I have not driven the high-level cars in any discipline yet, but what I've seen is the braking force seems to be extremely high. Okay, and what this amounts to is the higher the braking force, the quicker the stopping power, or what most likely seems to be happening is you lock up the tires and you have no grip at all, and you have no ability to steer the car either. So you might even think about, if you're having particular trouble under braking, if the car just wants to go straight or it starts to become erratic or something, then reduce this braking force some. It can help you get control of the car. Now keep in mind, you're reducing the braking force, so you may need to back up your corners a little bit, brake a little bit earlier, but I think it can be worth the trade-off of a little bit longer braking zone as opposed to better control. So keep that in mind. You might want to lower the braking force some. And then we get to probably the most important adjustment that I would look at here, and that's the brake bias. Okay, we can go front to rear with this number, and you can see by default, it throws me in at 75% front brake. And what that means is 75% of this braking force is going to go to the front tires. Now, in general, more braking force in the front as opposed to the rear is a good thing. Again, some of this is going to be determined by driving style, but in general, more on the front tires than the rear tires will be a good thing. But just keep in mind that that might not necessarily always be more is better. Okay, particularly if you like to use a technique called trail braking, where as you're turning into a corner or going through a corner, you like to drag the brake a little bit, then you can use this to help the car to turn, or maybe even tighten it up a little bit. Let's say you're a little bit too loose going through the corners. The car wants to swing the back end around more than you want it to. You might push a little front brake into it and then drag the brake a little bit going through the corner, and it can help tighten that up for you. The reverse is also true. Let's say you're in a car, particularly a four-wheel drive car, where the front wheels are doing all the work. You can move a little of the brake bias toward the rear, and you can see we can go down from 75 down to 61%. By moving more of the braking force to the rear, it's going to allow that rear end to swing around a little bit more, helping the car to turn. So keep that in mind. It's a very easy adjustment, a very quick adjustment to make, and it may be that you don't need anything more than this to really help your stage times. So again, a very easy adjustment along with the camber to pick up the lap times or stage times, as the case may be. Now we'll get into the differential. Now remember, this is a front-wheel drive car, so we're going to take a look here in just a few moments at a four-wheel drive car and see another adjustment it has available that this one doesn't. But for a front-wheel drive car, we're looking at three options. Now we're going to essentially ignore the bottom two. I'll say a quick note that the preload is essentially how much of a locked condition do you want. In this case, we don't really have to worry about it. We're in full lock, or at least as much of a full lock as this particular car allows. What you can do here, and again, this isn't necessarily the first thing I would recommend playing around with. This is a little bit more advanced, but if you do want to get in here and play around with this, this can help you. And this is the driving lock, which means when you're under power, whenever the differential is engaged and you're accelerating the car, the more you have it slid toward the locked condition, the tighter the car is going to be. That means it's going to want to understeer and not turn as well. So keep that in mind. If maybe you get on the throttle and the car is too loose, it wants to spin around on you. One of the things that may be happening is maybe you've got the differential too open. And essentially the difference between open and locked, again, just assuming we're talking about full lock and full open as opposed to what we're dealing with here. But if the differential is fully open, it means that the two tires, in this case the front tires, are free to spin at different rates. And that's what can get you in trouble. If you get it too open for your driving style, then it could cause you to become erratic, spin out, that kind of thing. So if you want to have the car be more stable under you whenever you get on the throttle, you can move it toward the lock side. Now, if you're familiar and used to driving asphalt cars, like the NASCAR cars, the Cup cars, the Busch cars, whatever the case may be, they have a locked rear end, which makes them tighter on the throttle. So they're on the locked end of this. Okay, again, the braking lock and the preload. The braking lock is essentially the opposite of what we're talking about with the driving when you're not on the gas. But I tend not to mess around a whole lot with this because it can also get you in trouble. Preload, the more preload you get in here, the quicker you get to the locked position. So that's something that you might try as well. Move this all the way to the high side, as well as put this on lock to give you as much stability as you can get out of the differential. Okay, we're not going to spend any time on gearing. Gearing is pretty much what you would think. And this is more in advance and probably not something that most people are going to have to mess around with unless you're really, really fine tuning. I haven't messed with it really at all, simply because all of the stages are different lengths and different types of corners. So it really hasn't paid any dividends for me to spend a whole lot of time here. But I can tell you that if you're going to spend time here, you're probably going to want to spend most of your time on the final drive. Shorter final drive, if you need more acceleration and you don't really have any high-speed corners, or at least long stretches, straight stretches on the circuit, then you can go more toward the short side. If you have a less complex course with a lot of high-speed corners, then you might want to go toward the long side, just to make sure you can get more top-end speed out of the car. Okay, I already mentioned we're not dealing with the dampening or the shocks. We're going to move straight on to the springs. Now, in the case of the springs, you've got a few options here. You can go ride height, you can go spring rate, front and rear, and you can go anti-roll bar, front and rear. The first thing I want to tell you is the lower you can get the car, the better. But of course, since we're running on dirt and different types of surfaces, bumps and dips and all that kind of thing, you have to be careful about how low you get the car before it starts to really hit the surface, and which can cause the car to behave erratically. So a good rule of thumb is get the car as low as you can without it hitting. Okay, and that's going to take some getting used to and some adjusting and some testing to see how low you can get it. Now, I can tell you that if you're on asphalt, you can really get by with lowering this quite a bit. And what it does is it lowers the center of gravity in the car, and it makes the car able to corner better without as much weight transfer side to side and front to rear. So the lower, the better. Just be careful about getting it too low. Okay, spring rates. Again, you can see it starts right out in the middle. If you're on asphalt, you'll want, in general, a firmer spring. You'll want a stronger spring. So we start out at 400. We can go up to 474. If we go down, we can go down to 331. So a little bit of adjustability there. Not as much as I'm used to with the asphalt cars and NASCAR type cars, but there is some adjustability. And as it mentions in the bottom right, just below the picture here, you can see that firm springs will improve the stability. That helps to control the roll of the body and the weight transfer around the car, which can make the car more erratic. But soft springs are helpful in absorbing some of the bumps. Okay, they're not quite as stable, but they can really help the car to absorb over the bumps. And that is a very good thing, particularly if you're going over a lot of bumps and swells and dips in the track, which of course happens a lot off-road. So play around with this. There are some types of surfaces that maybe you find that it's better to run softer springs in the front and the rear. Others you might want to run a stiffer spring, particularly if you're running on asphalt. Try out these firmer springs because the car will react quicker. It'll be more stable, but again, it's something you have to get used to because the car will really respond quicker if you have the car lower to the ground and stiffer springs. So be ready for that. Now, the anti-roll bars, front and rear, I would not recommend spending a whole lot of time on these because you can really mess the car up. These essentially assist with the spring rate in trying to control the roll of the body left and right. So they can really help in controlling the car and giving you quicker responses. However, if you're not careful, you can pick the inside tire up off the ground when you're going through a corner, which is not what you want to do. So, for instance, if you're going through a left-hand corner, a very tight left-hand corner, and you have too stiff of a front roll bar going through a left-hand corner, you might pick the left front tire up off the ground. Going through there, not what you want to do, so be very careful about getting very firm with these. Okay, so with that in mind, we're going to back out here, and we'll be back in just a few moments looking at a four-wheel drive car. All right, so now we're back with the Subaru WRX, and this is an NR4 division car, and the reason I chose this car is because I knew it was all-wheel drive, and I've driven it a little bit in our career mode series that we have going on the channel. Now, when I drove it in the career mode, it was extremely tail happy for me, and I knew there were some adjustments I wanted to make, but in the spirit of the career mode, I did not make any adjustments. But this car is, by default, for me, again, everybody's going to be different based on how you drive the car and also what wheel and pedal set you're using, whether you're driving with a keyboard, a pad, whatever the case may be. But for me, it was very tail happy and very hard for me to control out of the box. So we're not going to go through every option here. Instead, we're just going to spend a little bit of time on the differential. And immediately you can tell that there are more options here than what we had previously in our front wheel drive car. Now, again, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on these. Again, we're looking at the same basic idea. You got three options here, front and rear. What I'm most interested in here for the purposes of this video is the torque bias. And this is a very easy adjustment, I think, to understand, as well as a very important adjustment to help with your enjoyment of the car. Okay, so we're dealing with a front wheel drive car here, which means that both the front and the rear wheels are powering the car under throttle. And that's great for the purposes of traction. It can really help us out. But we have some options here. What percentage of this do we want to put, of the power do we want to put toward the front? What percentage do we want to put toward the rear? We can literally change the entire handling of the car with this one adjustment and not doing anything else that we've talked about in this video. So in this case, right now you can see we're 45% to the front. So 55% of the power from the engine is going to the rear tires. Okay, the more we move this to the rear, okay, you can see now we're only 35% of the power is going to the front tires. What this does is the more power you put to the rear tires, the more this car is going to behave like a rear-wheel drive car, which is to say that the rear end wants to steer the car. It's going to get very loose in the corners. The rear end is going to want to slide around on you quite a bit. So if you want that feeling of the rear end coming around very easy, and that is certainly a fast way to go, particularly on dirt, is you need to get the rear end out and around to help with some of these tighter corners particularly. But maybe it's a little bit too much for your driving style, and you say, look, I don't want the rear end driving the car quite that much. I don't want the rear end of the car to be quite that loose or oversteer. So then you would move toward the front. Now we've moved over half of the power to the front wheels, in this case 65%. And by doing so, we have changed. That is a huge change from where we had at only 35% to the front. Okay, so we've almost doubled the percentage of the power that is going to the front tires. And the more we put toward the front tires, the tighter this thing, or the more understeer we're going to get anytime we touch the throttle. Now again, you have to match this to your driving style and understand what you're going to get. If you're somebody who likes to be on the throttle a lot, then you have to decide, okay, do I want to try to steer the car with the throttle pedal or the brake? If you want to steer it with the throttle, maybe you want to put more toward the rear. But if you say, no, I don't really like to do that, I want the car to be more stable, then moving it toward the front will definitely help you out. Okay, so keep that in mind. If you're going to do nothing else, if you don't want to change anything else, if you're in a front wheel, an all-wheel drive or a four-wheel drive car, then take a look at this particular adjustment. By default for this car, they put just shy of 50%. So a little bit more than half of the power is going to the rear wheels. That was a bit too much for me. I enjoyed the feeling of it, but it was probably a bit much. So I tried moving it up to 65%, changed the entire car for me, and made it much more accessible, much more stable on the throttle. So again, give that a try. Other than that, essentially everything we've already talked about is the same with this particular car. You're going to find a few changes here and there with the different types of cars, but for the most part, stick with these adjustments if you're just getting started, or if you're just looking for some quick adjustments. Thank you very much for joining me, and stay tuned for more Dirt 4 with Knee Pit Gaming.